Now, the rest of the story. Ben's nephew was 65 years old, living in London, when for some reason or other he became interested in rare books. Interested enough to invite a rare book dealer to his home. The gentleman brought with him a little of this and a little of that, one prize in particular, an extensive collection of political pamphlets dating back to the previous century. Well, Ben's nephew rifled through one or two, idly glancing at an illustration here and a word there, and then he stopped cold. He stopped so suddenly and stared so intently that the book dealer was compelled to ask, "Are you all right, sir?" Oh, yes, the prospective client was quite all right. But what had attracted his attention was something written in the margin of one of the pamphlets, handwriting, and moreover, the hand script of somebody very special, the client's own Uncle Ben. My, you would have enjoyed him, the client told the book dealer. My uncle the poet, my uncle the dreamer, my uncle Benjamin Franklin. For this is the rest of the story. Ben Franklin was already up in years when he went to live in Boston with his much younger brother Josiah and Josiah's little boy, then only 9. Uncle Ben and his nephew bonded immediately. "What's that?" the little boy would eagerly ask, surprising Ben at his writing desk. Well, that might have been almost anything. A treasured collection of political pamphlets, a crude sketch of some visionary device, a unique system of shorthand for recording quickly spoken words. Or that might even have been an original poem which Ben would proudly recite to the child perched spellbound on his knee. Now the boy's father, Josiah Franklin, had always loved and looked up to his older brother Ben, much as his own child was becoming enamored a generation later. And yet while Josiah had never thought himself misled, he grew concerned that his own son might be seduced into a life of daydreaming under Ben's influence. And so it was that during the 4 years that Ben lived under his brother's roof, Josiah struggled to offset what he believed as Ben's impractical example. For instance, when the little boy, imitating Uncle Ben, began writing poetry, Josiah roundly ridiculed it. For the child's own good, he told himself. And then Josiah would march the youngster out to the workshop for a crash course in some useful, everyday craft. And thus did Ben Franklin's nephew grow up magnificently confused, at once clinging to the practical and longing for the impossible, and occasionally combining the two. You never knew Josiah, the down-to-earth daddy, who infected his child with all things pragmatic and sensible. But then again, you never knew Uncle Ben either. Instead, you remember and revere the namesake nephew, who learned realism from his father and idealism from his uncle, and a fledgling nation became infinitely richer thereby. For the little boy whose formative years were spent under the equally powerful influences of 2 very different men, his name also was Ben. He was the founding father you know as Benjamin Franklin. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Benjamin Franklin, our founding father, is one of my favorite people to research. If I could go back in time and meet a famous historical figure, Benjamin Franklin would be among my top 3. When surnames became necessary, people adopted names that had some meaning to them. Many of those surnames still exist today. For example, families from the upper classes tended to adopt the titles of their domains, such as Lancaster or Salisbury. Their tenants sometimes adopted surnames based on their own little place in the world, such as Hill or Meadows. Artisans tended to adopt their trade names, such as Smith, Taylor, Turner, or Weaver. A smith referred to a blacksmith or a gunsmith. A tailor made clothing. A turner was someone who turned wood on a lathe, and a weaver created all sorts of things by interlacing materials. But what did the name Franklin refer to? Benjamin Franklin's ancestors were members of an independent middle class called freeholders. They became known as Franklins with a lowercase f, which came from the Middle English word Franklin, spelled F-R-A-N-K-E-L-E-Y-N, which meant free men. This certainly fits with what we think of our founding father, Benjamin Franklin. The earliest known use of the last name Franklin was our founding father's great-great-grandfather, Thomas Franklin, who was born about 1540 in Ecton, Northamptonshire, England. Little is known about Thomas Franklin other than the fact that his independent spirit became part of family lore. Independent spirit. In his autobiography, Ben Franklin, the founding father, wrote, "This obscure family of ours was early in the Reformation, and were sometimes in danger of trouble on account of their zeal against popery." According to author Walter Isaacson, when Queen Mary I was engaged in her bloody crusade to re-establish the Roman Catholic Church, Thomas Franklin kept the banned English Bible tied to the underside of a stool. The stool could be turned over on a lap so the Bible could be read aloud, but then instantly hidden when the apparitor rode by. The strong yet pragmatic independence of Thomas Franklin, along with his clever ingenuity, seems to have been passed down right along to our founding father. The Franklin family produced dissenters and nonconformists who were willing to defy authority, but not to the point of becoming fanatics. Dissenters, nonconformists, defying authority. Today, thanks in part to the Franklin family, we have freedom of religion. Benjamin Franklin wrote in his autobiography about visiting Ecton to collect information about his ancestors. He learned that the dissenting streak went beyond matters of religion. Thomas Franklin's father had been a legal advocate for a common man in a controversy over the practice known as enclosure. Now, under the system of enclosure, the aristocracy closed off their large estates and prevented poorer farmers from grazing their herds on their land. With our rights of life, liberty, and in this case, property, Americans still use the system of enclosure to fence in our property. Thomas's son, Henry, was imprisoned for a year for writing some poetry which, as one descendant noted, touched the character of some great man. Henry was jailed for writing poetry which portrayed the elite in a negative light. Today, thanks in part to the Franklin family, we have freedom of the press. Henry's son, Thomas II, displayed traits that appeared in our founding father. Thomas II was an outgoing person who loved reading, writing, and tinkering with things. As a young man, he built a clock from scratch that worked throughout his life. Now that might not seem like much of an achievement now, but in the early 1600s, it was most impressive. Benjamin Franklin invented all sorts of things, including bifocals, the lightning rod, swimming fins which attach to the hands, a urinary catheter which is frighteningly large, and the invention which, as Ben Franklin said, has given me the greatest personal satisfaction, the glass harmonica. Not harmonica with an H, harmonica with an A. Now let's look at Benjamin Franklin, the uncle and namesake of our founding father. To reduce confusion, we'll call him Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben was born to Thomas Franklin and Jane White in 1650 in Ecton, Northamptonshire, England. As was the custom in the 1600s, a father taught his oldest son the family trade, and the younger sons would eventually apprentice under the older son. Most villages were too small to necessitate several practitioners of the same trade, so the sons had to move to other villages to be successful. In the 1670s, Josiah, Uncle Ben's younger brother, moved to another village and set up shop as a silk and cloth dyer. Now my own last name, Dison, originally spelled D-Y-S-O-N, came about in the same manner. When surnames were being adopted in England, my ancestors were like Josiah, dyers of cloth and silk. The sons of the dyer adopted the surname Dison. After a while, the younger Franklin sons were struggling to make a living because of the large number of tradesmen in England. Rents were high, but income was low. At about the same time, Oliver Cromwell's Puritan rule came to an end and the monarchy was restored, which led to restrictions on the Puritans. In his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin said that the Franklins, well, that's Uncle Ben, his wife Catherine, Josiah, James, and Jonathan, immigrated to America over the period of about 3 decades more for economical than religious reasons. The colonies needed tradesmen and rents were low. Unfortunately, the colonies did not need silk dyers. Josiah learned the trade of making tallow soap and candles, and his business thrived. Unlike Josiah, Uncle Ben did not have the drive nor desire to learn a new trade. He took up residence in Josiah's household. Uncle Ben whiled away the hours writing bad poetry and the Franklin family history. He attended and transcribed sermons, amused his nephew, the young Benjamin Franklin, and most of all, he got on Josiah's nerves. Benjamin Franklin later wrote about his father and Uncle Ben's many disputes and misunderstandings, yet they loved each other, well, at least from a distance. Josiah once said that visits from relatives could not well be short enough for them to part good friends. After 4 long years, Uncle Ben had completely worn out his welcome and moved out of Josiah's house. He took up residence with one of his own sons. In an article published in Poor Richard's Almanac many years later, Benjamin Franklin put it a little more bluntly. Fish and guests stink after 3 days. Even after 300 years, Ben Franklin's quote is still as relevant today as it was in the 1700s. Don't you think? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.